Hey everybody, welcome back to Therapist Theater. I'm your host, Josh Treese. I'm a practicing therapist in Music City, USA, and every week a guest therapist, counselor, or social worker joins me in the theater to talk about a movie that we've seen and what relationships or mental health issues it highlights. Thanks so much for downloading today's show. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes, and while you're doing that, you can help other people find the show by giving it a 5-star rating and writing a review for it in the podcast app. Oh yeah, and make sure you tell your friends. You can also stay connected with what's happening in the theater by following us on social media. Links to our accounts are in the show notes. This week's guest is Dave Verhaagen. Dave is a nationally board-certified psychologist, the founder of Southeast Psych, the author of 8 books and 9 book chapters, and the executive producer of 2 feature-length documentaries. Let's get this show started, shall we? Dim the lights, raise the curtain, and start the previews. Welcome to the theater. Dave, how in the world are you today? Welcome to the theater.
Thanks, Josh. Good to be here.
I am so excited to have you on. I was telling my wife this morning that it took us a couple of volleys to get it worked out, but we finally did. I'm so happy it's here.
I know I am a near disaster when it comes to scheduling these days. I don't know why, but lately I've just been a near disaster. So I'm glad we're finally connecting.
Well, I'm sure global pandemics don't have anything to do with that kind of thing.
Probably very little. Yeah. There's very little going on in the world, very little stress. That's the good news.
Yeah.
And by the way, after we record this, the date that this drops, there will be news in the world that we don't know right now.
That's true. Yeah. We're recording this pre-election.
Yeah.
It'll get posted post-election.
Just barely, right? Just a couple days.
We are like a Schrodinger's cat of election news right now.
That should be the subtitle of your podcast, or even of this episode.
I think so. Yeah, that'd work out well. Yeah. So usually I say no spoilers, or I say we are going to do spoilers, so spoiler warning to others. But I think maybe I should say, hey, world, no spoilers to us about what's going to happen, because our podcast selves won't know when this comes out.
I know. So weird to think that when people are hearing this, our podcast selves didn't know what they know. I guess that's just how it works anyway. So
yeah, I guess so. I am going to be practicing just a lot of self-care this week, because it is totally in my nature to obsess about current news and events. And so
are you a news junkie?
I'm a news junkie when I'm afraid. And so I've already listened to a podcast from the New York Times this morning and been on the news feed and all that. And so I've kind of worked out with my wife that at a certain point, probably tomorrow morning, I'm going to go, I guess radio silent, although it's not going to be me that's silent. It's going to be me making everything else silent.
Right. You're going into the cave.
Yeah, I'm going to cave up. That's my term for when I need to express my introvertedness too. So I'll practice that.
Are you an introvert?
Oh yeah. Big time.
Really?
Yeah. Well, I'm an introvert that loves people. I get the energy from being alone, but I do it knowing that I want to spend it.
Okay. That makes sense. And I guess podcasting allows, it's not like giant crowd and being around a big group. It's just like one-on-one conversation. It fits an introvert.
One-on-one conversation. Although I'll tell you, I went into this year planning, we were going to do a couple of live events where we had maybe 3 guests and me up on the stage, and we were going to have an audience and we were going to do some live stuff. And then that just got, shut down.
Blown up.
Yeah, pretty conclusively in March. But my first career, I had to do public speaking usually around 3 times a week. And so I don't get nervous with crowds. It's more like, I'd rather be the guy at the party that finds one person to talk to in the corner for an hour rather than being a butterfly that goes through the whole guest list.
I'm kind of the opposite, although as I've gotten older, I'm much more cool with just sitting with one person at a party or a small group or something. But I like the crowd. I like the energy of it. The pandemic's hard because you're just not able to be around a group of people where there's an energy about the group.
Yeah, I had a guest on earlier this year where we were kind of speculating if the pandemic hadn't turned personality types upside down a bit, because she had claimed to be a big time extrovert in like every way. And because of the pandemic had been socially distanced with her son and husband, and was saying to her, to me, hey, if I could get just time by myself with Bravo, trash TV, it'd just be great. And I'm the introvert, and I was saying to her, I'd love to walk through Target high-fiving everybody and like talking to everybody right now. So I think that this kind of collective global trauma has kind of, maybe switched us all topsy-turvy, and we're going to come out the other side appreciating, hopefully, our mirror images a lot more.
Although I think there's a bit of a death wish in there for you, Josh, walking through Target, high-fiving people. I mean, of all the things, it's a
well,
interesting thing to want to do.
Yeah, metaphorically walking through Target and high-fiving everybody. But but if I have to employ a set of coveralls and a helmet and some rubber-banded rubber gloves, I'll do what I got to do.
So be it.
Well, I want to start by asking you about, did you, before you got into therapy as either a client, student, practitioner, however you started, before that, did you have any conception of what therapy or counseling or a therapist or counselor was?
Just a little bit. So I was never in therapy, even as a kid or even as an adult, and I'm not sure that's entirely good, but so I never had a first person experience of being in therapy. So my experience of therapy, or my conception of it, was largely connected to movies. And the movie we're going to talk about played a big role in that. And I'll talk about that as we get into the movie. But a lot of the depictions of therapists that I saw were the closest I got to what therapy is or is about. So it wasn't from first person experience. It was from media. There probably was a point when I was younger when therapy would have been good for me. I had a pretty easy childhood, and no, I wasn't an angsty kid. I wasn't a kid that struggled with behavior or emotions, but I had a really significant event happen. And probably in the aftermath of that should have been at least a little bit in therapy. And that was when I was 9 years old. My Aunt Charlene took me and my brother over to her apartment. And so my aunt was the younger sibling of my dad. So she was only like 12 years older than we were. And she took us in her little Volkswagen Beetle over to her apartment, got over there, and she had cats. I had a little allergy to cats, got a little asthmatic. So she said, well, we'll go, put us back in the car. And then we're driving down, it was Tidewater Drive in Norfolk, Virginia. And my brother, who was 5, I was 9, I was sitting in the passenger seat. He was in the seat behind her. If you have any awareness of the 1970s, the kids did not wear seatbelts, cars were not safe, and so he was standing in the footwell of the behind her seat, and he got an ice scraper, which, by the way, this was in the summer, so pick up the nearest ice scraper, and he was hitting, like tomahawk hitting, the back of her chair. Pat, 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 pat. And she said, Brian, stop, Brian, stop. And she reaches back behind her to push him up on the seat. And when she did, she smashed into a telephone pole at about 45 miles an hour. So the next thing I know, I'm being dragged across the driver's seat. So the entire, my side is collapsed. There's a telephone pole sitting basically in the car, and I'm having to be extricated through the other side, pulling me out of the driver's seat. And as they're doing that, I come to, I've been knocked out, and I look, and there's blood all over the dashboard. There's blood all over the seat. And I realize that's my blood. I can't feel anything, but I realize that's me. They lay me on the street. Bystanders and pedestrians come running up. They look at me and start crying. So I knew it was bad. I couldn't feel anything, but I knew it was bad. So long story short on this one, my face was basically split. And you're watching me on video. They can't see the listeners, but I have a scar here that goes to here, that goes to here.
Oh, wow.
And so my jaw was shattered. My teeth were all knocked out. My face was ripped open. Pretty bad. Reconstructive surgeries, teeth wired back in, that kind of thing. All right. So 2 things to say about that. First, this was 3 days before school was out in 3rd grade for me. And then I was going to start 4th grade, a couple months later at a new school. And I remember thinking, because I was still scarred up and stitched up, and I remember thinking, I'm either going to walk in there and care about what other people think about my face, or I'm not going to care about that. I was like a little junior therapist here, I remember plain as day thinking that, like, I'm either going to go in there and I'm going to be very self-conscious and care, or I'm going to go in there and not care. So I'm going to go in there and not care. And so that's an interesting moment as I reflect on it. But then about a year later, so I would say emotionally, I was kind of down through that summer, but through the year, okay. About a year later, I started having these very intense experiences that would just wash over me. My heart would race, things seemed up close. I felt this sense of like my body being squeezed almost. I felt disoriented, had no idea. And it would happen, by the way, interestingly, it would happen if I was out in the rain. It would happen during thunderstorms. It would happen in the bathtub or shower. It would happen in a pool. And it would just come over me in this very intense way. And I would try to describe it to my parents. Again, I'm at this point 10 years old, trying to describe this. And they had no idea what was going on, none. So they take me to, I think, a neurologist. They do, an EEG, they do a sleep study. They're like, no, we can't figure it out. We don't know what it is. And so that was it. There was no follow-up. There was no recommendation to see a therapist. There was no sense that this was in the realm of psychology rather than maybe neurology. Like they're assuming, like, did he hit his head really hard and he's having some neurological effect? It wasn't until 10 years later, I was in college as either a sophomore, maybe a sophomore or so, taking a class in, like psychopathology. And they started talking about panic attacks. And I went, that's what that was. I was having panic attacks. And by the way that I worked it out was kind of the way I worked out going to school, was like, well, I don't know what this is, but I'm either going to be really scared of it, or I'm just going to be like annoyed with it. And I'm going to go, when it happens, I'm just going to be annoyed with it and let it pass. And I don't know what to call it. I don't want to know what it is, but I'm not going to get freaked out by it. By the way, interesting little sidebar. I also figured out later what triggered it. And
I was going to ask, was it raining when the accident happened? Did it happen near water? I mean,
keep going. So think about what was happening. I would get in a pool, someone would splash me. I'd be in a shower, water would hit my face. I would be out in, like, playing baseball, and it would start to sprinkle.
Blood? So was it the blood
that was it? Blood splatter.
Wow.
So when the accident happened, I had blood all over my face, splattered. So anytime any kind of moisture liquid would splatter on my face, it would hit it. that was just fascinating to me. And that was also part of for me, like, oh, this is fascinating how the human brain works.
Yeah.
Right. It
Is
was
that
like,
still a trigger for you?
no, I haven't had a panic attack in, well, I was going to say 40 years, but clearly I'm not that old. So, but a long time. Like, I haven't had after I kind of got to the point where I'm like, whatever this is, people can't figure it out. Whatever it is, I can't be scared of it. I'm just going to be annoyed with it. Then they just faded and went away, which is exactly what you learn in cognitive behavioral therapy. You learn that, right? If you approach it with fear, they continue and grow. And if you approach it more with sort of like acceptance and maybe even a little annoyance, then they fade.
Which the guiding thesis of CBT would be, how you think affects how you feel. So let's pull off the back panel, examine the wiring, and see what the controlling thoughts are. And if they are, let's say, unproductive, let's do some reframes. Let's find different ways of thinking about it.
Yeah.
And then proceed forward. How is your little brother? I didn't hear. Is he all right?
He is all right. We are very close still to this day. He had a scar from the top of his head all the way down to his eyelid.
Wow.
So his eye was spared, but his eyelid was cut open. It was a very deep wound, and it was stitched up all the way down. And this is my favorite story from that, if there can be such a thing. And that is, he had this big scar, and then he saw a picture of Frankenstein. He said, "Mom, I look just like Frankenstein." And she goes, "Oh, sweetie, you don't look like Frankenstein." He goes, "No, I look like Frankenstein." And he'd walk around saying, "I look like Frankenstein." And she would always say, "Sweetheart, you don't look like Frankenstein." So the day that he went to the hospital, I was with them. I remember, I have an independent recollection of this. This is not some like story that people are like constructing. I remember it. He went to the hospital to get his stitches out, and the nurse came out and said, "Hey, Brian, how are you?" And he says, my mother says I look like Frankenstein." And that nurse kind of look at my mom like, "You evil mother," like this. It was totally not true.
I thought where you were going to go with that was that your mom saying, "You don't look like Frankenstein. It's Frankenstein's monster. Frankenstein doctor."
No, she was insistent, "Sweetie, you don't look like Frankenstein." And then when he got there, he's like, "My mom says I look like Frankenstein."
Oh man.
So
and did your aunt,
anyway,
I mean, how was your aunt?
She, because she was turned around when it hit, she hit on the side of her face on the steering wheel, sort of bounced off of it. So, and the majority of the collision was on the passenger side.
Ooh.
So she had a cut along her eyebrow that was disguised. In other words, you never could see it after it got stitched up. So she was fine, although she freaked out, as you might imagine. Yeah. I remember that was one of the memories of her just literally running back and forth from the side of the car where I was, the side of the car where Brian was, screaming and was in shock. And I mean, it was ugly. It was a bad scene. And we can talk more later, but I that of course was a very significant event for me. And it has taught me a lot, not only about myself, but also about just the nature of resilience and some really good things. I think, that scene I told you about before I walked into the school building, thinking about how I was going to think about this day, was a very significant moment in me becoming a more confident person.
Yeah, that's pretty extraordinary for a child as young as you were to kind of arrive at that. I mean, defining moment.
I was a weirdly a weirdly psychologically minded kid, and I don't know why or how. I mean, the things that I did during that time, in retrospect, were that kind of reframe before I went to school. and I'm not trying to praise myself. I'm just fascinated with reflecting on that and saying, as a 9 or 10-year-old, to think about that, to think about, I'm having these panic attacks. I don't know what they are. My parents were like, I don't know what it is. And they just sort like, they didn't think, well, maybe he should see a therapist who could help him with whatever this is. And I was sort of like, well, I guess I got to figure it out. And I guess I shouldn't be scared of it, because they get worse when I get scared of it.
Part of me this yeah, I mean, clearly you must have had some kind of secure attachments to feel a big enough anchor inside of you to where you were able to say that, and not like most, I would say, teenagers or children walking into school going, however these kids treat me is how I will think about myself.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good way to frame it. I think I was a securely attached kid. And so I think I had that base. Like I told you, apart from that, my childhood was relatively unremarkable. It was pretty normal, and not, I wasn't, I think by temperament, not a very angsty kid, not a kid prone to, I was sort of like wired to be more positive and optimistic and uh, fun, and that kind of, so I sort of had that baseline temperament and then a secure attachment. So I had this experience happen. So those things, I didn't do that. I didn't give myself a secure attachment or a good temperament, but they certainly helped a lot for that moment.
Yeah. And I really don't think you would have been able to kind of arrive at, that kind of Robert Frost fork in the road of self-conception unless you would have had those things kind of given to you or set up for you.
Right. For sure.
So, I mean, I think you've already kind of laid the groundwork, but I want to throw it out there formally. So first, let me say, I really identify with your conceptions of therapy coming from movies and TV and stuff. I mean, I've said it a million times on the show, but like Frasier Crane was all I knew of therapy before I became a client. And even then, it was mainly Frasier Crane from Frasier, not from Cheers. And so it was him as a advice giver, radio host kind of, so thinking that a therapist was like a sage that you would come and sit at the feet of and present a problem and they would give you an answer and then everything would be fixed. And I think because of that and several other things, but I had a fear, I think, of going, I look back, I remember somebody asked me a while ago, if you could go back in time and say anything to your 18-year-old self, what would you say? And I think I answered something like, I'd say go to therapy now instead of waiting another 15 years, which is when I actually went when I was 33. But I think I had this, I think maybe fear or maybe it was shame that was stopping me, because I just thought, well, if I go, it's admitting that there's something wrong with me. Because I'm going because that's all they do is fix people. And I don't want there to be anything wrong with me. So I identify with that. And that's why I always ask that question, is because I'm curious, did people get their conception of therapy, from the media? Did they get it? I don't think I've had anybody maybe one guest whose parents were a therapist. And other than that, I think it seems to be, and hopefully as we move forward in history, this will change, but it seems to be this thing that happens behind a curtain, that until you go, the best you have is what other people portray it as.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that's, unless you've had, it's like a lot of parts of life. Until you have children, you don't know what it's like to have children. And until you're married, you don't know what it's like to be married, unless you've struggled with fill in the blank, cancer, infertility, whatever it might be. You can have a rough conception of it, but you don't have a lived-in conception of it until that happens. And therapy is one of those things. It's like, unless you're in it, you don't know quite what that's like. And that's actually one of my favorite things, is having, because I see young adult age guys, many of them have been in therapy when they were kids, but some of them, they're in their 20s, have never had an experience in therapy, and they don't know what it's like. They don't know what to expect. And they come in and they say that, I don't know what this is like. What am I supposed to do? Or what is this? How does this work? And in some cases, depending on how they're wired, they want to kind of like control the thing that they don't know how it's supposed to work, and sort of, be very controlling about like how this unfolds and so on. And so it's actually really, I will say, fun but rewarding to have someone that's not had that experience and then give them a really good experience of being in therapy. That's a delightful thing.
Well, that kind of speaks to, we've said it a couple of times on the show, the main tool of the therapist is the therapeutic relationship. So, when we as a therapist can kind of build a good rapport, show that we can be trusted, be there, be dependable, be responsible to, not responsible for, then magic can happen.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Therapy is an awesome thing. It really is. I mean, I will tell you, I was working on a writing project and we did a file review of 100 random clients of mine. And of that 100, I think it was 94, I think that's the number, came in. And again, bear in mind, I'm seeing older teens and young adult guys. So it's unique to that population. But of that, 94 out of the 100 were there because someone else wanted them to come in, not because they asked to. It was a very small number of people that asked.
So semi-mandated.
Semi, or at least nudged or encouraged.
Yeah.
And of that 100, 75 of them in the first session made some comment that expressed that they were reluctant, a little resistant, didn't want to do it. But the majority of them, overwhelming majority of them, expressed that it was a good experience for them and that they wanted, that they elected to come back and to continue. And so, you think about it, it feels often very scary for someone who hasn't had the experience of it. It feels very weird. Like you said, for some people, like the idea that you have to have something majorly wrong with you or have to be mentally ill or something like that. And I mean, of course, that's certainly true that folks that struggle with mental illness or having major struggles, therapy is a very, very big part of their health sometimes. But even for people that just need things to get worked out or need things, they're essentially an intact person, but they might have an area that they need work on. It can be an extremely good experience for them that not only helps target that one area, but helps them grow in some ways that they didn't expect.
Yeah, it's that benefit of the unbiased listener, and so it's not even like something needs to be wrong, but if you're having trouble working out your feelings or thoughts on something, and the only people you have available to talk to about it are people involved in it,
right?
It's very difficult to kind of bounce stuff off the wall with no stakes in play.
Right.
And so to have the chance to do that with somebody who is not only unbiased, but is also trained in how to have those conversations, it's a big benefit.
And someone who can be unbiased, but also legitimately care, legitimately have empathy, right. Legitimately be invested in a boundaried way in your life and in your well-being. And so that's also a difference too, is that the experience of therapy is someone is really knowing me, they're really hearing me and listening to me, and they care, and yet they're not kind of baked into the other parts of my life in a way that they have their own kind of bias, agenda, way of seeing where my life should go.
Yeah. So I'll back up to what I was about to ask. Then when I went back there is, why therapy? You've unpacked it a little bit, and I know that we're going to unpack it a little bit more, but kind of asking it formally, is there anything that you want to kind of share that's not in regards to that defining, well, I don't want to say defining, but that significant incident in your childhood?
Well, I might be fooling myself, but I'm not 100% sure that incident was the main catalyst for me deciding to go in therapy. or to become a therapist. Maybe it is at a level that I'm not aware of. I think it certainly is in the level of fascination with how the human brain works and how, you know, how people think and what's going on in our heads. But I remember when I was a senior in high school, I took a test called the Strong Inventory, and it is a career interest inventory. And the way that it works is it takes your profile and it matches it up against hundreds of people who do other jobs, a variety of jobs, and it looks for how well your profile matches people who do certain jobs and are good at those jobs and like those jobs. So it's just sort of a matching thing. It's very, very nice test. And it came up, the top two for me as a senior in high school were film director and psychologist.
Huh.
At the point where I took that, I didn't really even know much about what a psychologist did other than, again, what I'd seen in movies.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had a very limited conception of what a psychologist was. And so I was very interested in film. I was very interested in broadcasting. And so because of that, I left high school, I picked a university that had a very good radio, TV, film major. And that was my major, leaning toward my area of emphasis or specialization was in broadcasting. And I ended up working in radio for a number of years, starting about my sophomore year in college, all the way through grad school. And in doing that, realized this is not a good career. I mean, God bless people who are doing radio, and I did it for 7-8 years or so. And there's elements of it. I mean, I did the best parts of radio. I did interview shows. I did morning drive shows. I did afternoon drive. I mean, I worked at about 5-6 different radio stations. I got to do really cool radio. But what you realize is, man, there is such a kind of a roteness, a repetition, a kind of and then later more of corporate control that was just like, oh, this is not life-giving. So I'm in college and I'm thinking ahead and thinking, could I be 40 years old and do this job? I don't think I could. So I remember thinking, well, the other thing that was popping up on my interest inventory was psychologist. I started exploring psychology as a major. I changed my major. I started reading books about psychology, and then I just got lit up with it again. And I knew in a very naive way that the things that I thought psychology was about, that I was probably good at. Like I knew I was good at talking to people, and I knew that I was good at solving problems. And that was in a very kind of 20, 21-year-old naive way, my conception of what it meant to be a psychologist. And in fact, that has ended up being the area of emphasis in my career. I have been a therapist, a practitioner, but that's, psychology is so broad that that's not even the majority of who goes into psychology ends up being, primarily a practitioner.
Mm-hmm.
But that was my kind of naive conception of it that really was born out of, well, I'm not sure I can do broadcasting all my life and love it. What's next? I did not have the benefit of parents that went to college, grandparents that went to college. I was the only person in my family that ever gone to college, except for my aunt who went for 1 year, I think, to a school and then left. So and my parents, very bright people, very capable, and also very accomplished for what they did in their lives and careers, had no idea of like how to even advise me. So I remember the closest advice I got from my dad for college. This was the extent of his college advising. We get in the car, and out of the blue, he says, this is my impression of my dad, by the way. It's not how he sounds, but this is my impression. David, why don't you go to Virginia Tech and become a engineering major? And I said, well, because I'm not good in math and I would hate engineering. And he went, okay. And that was it. And scene, right? That's it. That was, so I was left to my own devices, and it was really, in a very rudimentary way, hung on the, this career inventory of like, okay, these are the things you should consider. Go into some sort of mass communication or be a psychologist. So,
but it does go back to this level of self-awareness again, that when you kind of stood on the precipice of realizing this broadcasting thing is not fulfilling me in the way that I would like it to be, and I'd like to make a change, instead of, wandering the country alone, like, Bruce Banner in The Incredible Hulk, you kind of went inside and said, what do I have? What can I make out of that? And even remembering that you had taken that assessment, still just kind of is remarkable. I mean, because most 21-year-olds that are thinking, what do I do next, usually think, well, I'll go work for my dad, or I'll, and do that while I'm trying to figure it out. And then they never leave.
Yeah. And that's been my experience with a lot of clients, is that they either work for their dad, as you said, or they pick what I would call a safe major. Like they might pick something that, like, I've heard you can get a job with a business degree, so I'll be a business. And there's no thought to, would I like business? Am I good at that? It's just like, I've heard that you can get a job with this. And so for me, I kind of knew that I didn't have that. Like, I couldn't go into the family business. My dad was a spy for the government. Oh, that's another story for another time. A great story, by the way. Although I'm not 100% sure that he would ever call himself a spy, but he was. And also, they didn't have a personal experience of college to advise me. And so I knew I kind of had to figure it out on my own. And so, for good or bad, that was kind of the hand I was dealt. And it was like, okay, well, I guess this is the way I figure it out. I had some data that I can draw from, and I think that's how my mind works. It's like I'm a problem solver by nature. I like to research things, pull things together, and solve a good problem.
Which, in your dad's defense, is what an engineer is.
Yeah.
That's exactly what an engineer is.
Right.
You do got to learn a little math, but not much. I mean,
it wasn't a crazy idea. It just was, I've always been drawn more to the affective, to the communication side of things. I've realized in my career, the things that I've done, apart from being in a room one-on-one as a therapist, have been, I'm a writer. I was a broadcaster. I did a podcast. They're all ways of communicating in a relatively anonymous way. And I don't mean entirely anonymously. But a relative, meaning like the drive for me was never to be recognized or to be famous or to be pointed out in a restaurant. Even though I was, at one point I was on one of the top rated radio stations in a large metropolitan area in a prime shift for that. And we would do remotes and go out, do public things. Those are not the things, even though I like being around people, that really motivated me to go into broadcast. It was really about the communication of ideas. It was really about the dialogue of thoughts. And so interviewing on the radio, writing, conversations on podcasts, those were the things that really were highly motivating for me. It was a need to kind of connect around ideas and thoughts.
Wow. You might be my new hero. I mean, that's exactly why I started the show. How do I help people engage with their mental health and with relationship health? And how do I do it in a way that doesn't require them to go out and grab a textbook or a book and then come back and discuss, So it's taking something that's already in their lives, movies, using that as the framework. to have those kinds of discussions.
And in fact, the practice that we have started here in Nashville, which was a sort of a plant or a sister practice of the practices that we had started in Charlotte, North Carolina, the mission is to get psychology to as many people as possible to enhance their lives. It's really a giving away of an equipping of people with psychology, because we believe that the ideas in psychology can really help people live better lives. And so again, it's getting outside of even the therapy space and more into the how can I give people information and ideas that at as big a level as I can to make their lives better. That's why when you approach me about the podcast, I jump at that, because the idea that it opens up psychology to more people is totally on mission for me.
Yeah, I heard I was listening to an episode of Brene Brown's podcast a couple of weeks ago, and she used a definition of creativity that I've decided I'm going to latch onto from now on. And she said it's finding ways to connect things that are seemingly not connected.
Yeah, that's a great definition.
And I really, really loved that.
Yeah. And that's also what is the key secret sauce for great comics, right? Is connecting these dots on things that someone else might have missed, but when you see it, all of a sudden it pops for you, and you're oh, I see the connection, or I see the unconnected thing that now is connected. But go ahead, I cut you off.
My wife has said that I've constantly got a tab open in the browser of my mind that's searching for connections between things. And so I read that I saw a post on Instagram or something this morning where it said something like that feeling when you finally find the song that, you've had the 5 words from its lyrics stuck in your head for a month, and you finally find out what it is. And I was like, oh, that happens to me all the time. Cause I do feel like my mind is like always looking for connections. And so when I find, or when something hits just the right way, it's like I can close that program. And then I get just a little bit more of the mind back. It is cool, except the times that it's not, and it's torturous.
Right. And it takes up so much landscape in your head, right?
Yeah.
It's got a lot of real estate going on up there. Well, but it also is probably why I assume, I don't know your work directly, but I assume that you're a good therapist, and it's probably that's what you bring to the therapy also, is the ability to hear something and then hear something down the road and say, oh, here's this sort of motif or this thread that someone, because they're so near to it, can't see, in a way that becomes potentially profoundly helpful to them.
It is. Well, and here's I think a little bit more specific way that I try to practice that is the majority of the work that I do is with people who are fighting against sexual addictions. And because it is such a shame-inducing thing, there's a lot of isolation. There's a lot of I'm the only ones. And so for me, it's a big passion to help them to feel connected back to the human race, because we all have shame and we all have feelings about things that I think would be easy if we chose to tell ourselves, well, I'm the only one that feels this way about this. Nobody else would ever think this. And I think that's something that I try to do with every client, is to normalize, to validate. And, my kind of catch, it started as something that I would say to clients, and it's become something I've said a lot on the show is, you have a bad case of being a person. And it's terminal. You're gonna die a person,
Yeah.
But it's also very, very inclusive. There's like 7 billion known cases at any one given time. And so I think I appreciate you saying that, and I think that's how it really works itself out, or at least I try to let it work itself out in my work. Because I think it would be really easy, and I do struggle against this at times, to not want to have a million books that I recommend to clients, or a million, podcasts or movies or something. And I've really struggled with that because I've learned that, wetting their whistle and letting them go out and find those things does a lot more than, just giving them a link to a Google map that tells them how to get to where they need to go.
Yeah, that's good stuff.
Well, let's talk about a movie. What movie did you bring for us to talk about today?
So the movie that I am thrilled to talk about is the movie that I would say changed my life. And that's the only movie that I can say that about. And it was my favorite movie for, I would say, the time it came out, which was in 1980, until the time The Lord of the Rings came out, whenever that came out. And so the Lord of the Rings trilogy, I would say, has usurped it as my favorite
It's
movie.
Quite the jump between those things.
Yeah. It was, and there's, I think, a reason for that as well.
Okay.
But so the movie is Ordinary People. It is a movie that came out in 1980. I was a junior in high school. It was the fall of 1980.
I was born.
It was the year you were born. And it's weird because it was also the year I was born. So that's so strange. No, so I was a junior in high school, and it was the first, I believe, R-rated movie I'd seen in a theater. And we had HBO on cable. And
Oh, no. If it came out in 80, it couldn't have been rated R, because the R rating came about with Temple of Doom. That was the first.
No.
I'm sorry, it came out after that. Temple of Doom was the catalyst for that.
No.
Really?
There are R-rated movies all through.
I'm sorry, I meant PG-13. So you're
right.
Yeah. That was that weird line, because it was either R or it was PG, and there were some things that happened in PGs that really should have,
That's right. And this one is actually the opposite, where it is a very soft R-rated movie, because they drop the F-bomb a number of times, but there's really no there's no sex, there's no violence, there's no really, anything other than a couple of choice words here and there.
Yeah.
And so it would have been probably a PG-13. So it's a very soft R, but it was the first R-rated movie that I had seen in the movie theater. I'd seen some movies like the original Halloween, which scared the crap out of me, on HBO, and things like that. But this was it. And my mom took me, and I was a little nervous because it was like R-rated movie. And then, but I remember being just enraptured with it. It was just captivating. And this was, by the way, the year before I took that interest inventory. And so I think in some ways may have primed the pump for my just sort of interest and fascination with this. So the story of Ordinary People is basically a story of a family that has lost a son, and the aftermath of that. And what that loss does is peel back the veneer, and all the things that were underneath that weren't right then get exposed. And it was, for me, because my family was not it was not a troubled family. It was not a chaotic family. It was just it was a very, I hate to say this, kind of garden variety in many ways. It was not idyllic, and it was not difficult or troubled. But to see that there was more below the surface, and that there was a way of getting to that, and a way of helping in that. So what happens in the movie is the surviving son, the oldest son, this is not giving anything away, they telegraph this from right out of the gate. The oldest son dies in a boating accident. The youngest son survives. And the youngest son later within that year, I think time frame wise, maybe 4 months later or so, I think it was, has a suicide attempt and then gets hospitalized and then comes out of the hospital and is still struggling. And the interface between him and his dad and his mom, and the family is working very hard. The dad working very hard to keep the family positive and happy. The mom working very hard to present the family as good to outsiders. And
mom's trying to maintain status quo.
And this sort of image of what the family needs to be like, to be in this sort of strata of society that they're in. And so is very uncomfortable with him seeing a therapist, is very uncomfortable with the dad talking about the son. By the way, let me just say, the movie won Best Picture, Best Director, Robert Redford, his directorial debut. The son, played by Timothy Hutton, his first feature film, one of the probably top 10 best film performances that I can think of. But she was nominated, did not win, but Mary Tyler Moore, holy mackerel. Holy mackerel, Mary Tyler Moore. So putting this in context, Mary Tyler Moore from 1970 all through the 70s was America's sweetheart. She was America's sweetheart. And this was back in the day when we had 3 networks and everybody watched the same shows. Everybody watched The Love Boat. Everybody watched Fantasy Island. Everybody watched Mary Tyler Moore. Everybody knew it. And it became its own little cottage industry. It spun off other shows, Rhoda, Phyllis, Lou Grant. She was it. She was America's sweetheart, this lovable, sweet woman. And then just a couple years later, after the show ends, she takes this role where she is the villain, essentially. Although not a thoroughly evil person, certainly not a person who's bad, a person who you can understand why she's motivated the way she is, but in the function of the story, she's the antagonist. She's the villain, and man, oh man, is she good in this movie.
Certainly against type from the character she played on the Mary Tyler Moore Show. And it also, you were rattling off the Oscars that it won. It also got Best Screenplay.
Yeah, Alvin Sargent.
Yeah,
he won 2 Oscars in his career and wrote all the Spider-Man movies and wrote Julia and Electric Horseman, and I mean, like a rock star of a screenwriter.
I was really surprised when I was digging in, kind of researching the movie, that Donald Sutherland didn't get nominated.
Yeah, he was the only principal in the movie who did not. Judd Hirsch got nominated.
Yeah, Mary Tyler Moore. I kind of wonder if that's because, he, I think, at least in their family system, was the most steadying presence, almost playing like a straight man, although not really. But you had these kind of big, expressive performances from Timothy Hutton and from Mary Tyler Moore, expressive in different ways. But he was, even in their attempt at coping with their son's death, Mary Tyler Moore was coping by trying to just get everything back to quote unquote the way it was. He seemed like he was willing to do the work. He just needed a little guidance. Like, he did try to talk to his son quite a few times. Hey, did you call that doctor that I got you that information about? Nope. Told you I'd call if I needed it. Several times trying to talk to her, but she shut it down.
On a performance level, I think he did spectacular, first of all, let me say. But his character has a intentional blandness to him.
Yeah.
It's a sort of a generic niceness. And it's only in the end where we start to see that get unraveled by what he's realizing has happened. And so he's sort of in this kind of oblivious, whether intentional or not, state through most of the movie, and then it sort of frays by the end. And so I think it was a brilliant performance, just like the others, but it just is not as showy. It's not and the thing with Mary Tyler Moore, I don't want to say this was a showy performance, because it wasn't, but it was perfectly, it was pitch perfect. She played it. There was not a misstep in the performance. Every scene was just right. There was a sequence that might be my favorite in the whole movie, although I could probably pick 5 or 6, 7. I mean, I can think of them just like that. But probably my favorite is, so she is not connecting with Timothy Hutton's character, the son. And
Conrad, yes.
Conrad, right. So Beth and Conrad. And Conrad is a very troubled kid at this point, and he's sitting on a lounge chair in the backyard, kind of half hanging off the chair, and without his coat on. And she looks out the window, and she's had this very difficult time connecting with him. And she goes out and she tries to have a conversation, and the conversation quickly devolves. So she starts having this conversation with him about him not having his coat on and it being cold, and all this, like, trying her best to connect. Then he starts bringing up how he wishes that he had a dog and that she didn't let them have a dog. And then she all of a sudden gets very defensive because he brings up the older brother who's passed away. She stands up from the chair she's sitting on in this very uncomfortable way, and then starts talking as he's talking, and then they talk over each other, and it only ends when he starts barking like a dog. It's this kind of all the stuff in the movies right there, including the fact that they can't communicate, and the theme of listening and hearing, which is the sort of dominant motif of the movie, is all sort of captured in there. They can't hear each other. They can't listen. She can't hear him. She can't listen. And so then she goes in the house and she's setting up the table for dinner with the rolled cloth napkins and all this. And he says, you can tell he's wanting to make it better. And he's, can I help you? No, I don't need any help. But one thing you can do is go up to that room and clean out that closet of yours, because it's a mess in there, right? So again, get away from me, go take care of this thing, this closeted, hidden thing. It's a mess in there. And then on the heels of that, the phone rings and she picks up the phone, and it's a friend. And then she is immediately into chit chat and laughing and having this, like this superficial sort of persona that then he connects with. The last time I saw her laughing was when my brother was still alive. I mean, that sequence is like dynamite.
Yeah, it's really a good kind of display of, I think, whenever a trauma happens, but B, also an attachment wound happens, it becomes like gravity, like relational gravity, where you can't really progress anywhere until you address it and until you heal it. And I get the feeling, watching the movie and then even listen to you describe that scene, anytime that the two of them tried to talk about anything, it probably escalated in some way close to that, because there's this giant thing in between them that they both know is there, but that Conrad, in looking to his mom as an attachment figure, is really hoping that she can offer some comfort and some acceptance and some love for. But, oh gosh, I forgot her, Beth. But Beth, who is trying to deal with this as best as she can as well, which is in kind of ignoring it, getting back to quote unquote the way things were, keeping up appearances. And because of that really rigid, I guess you'd say, worldview or method of going about it, it doesn't allow for her to be there for Conrad in the way that he needs her to be there.
That's right. And there is a significant line that the dad, Donald Sutherland, Calvin, I believe, says later, and it is that they are too much alike, and that they were the two people that did not cry at the funeral. And so it's sort of almost a line that'd be easy to miss, but it's sort of, they're bouncing off each other, right? They cannot, this wound is too much and too deep for them, that they cannot enter into it together.
Yeah.
Although that would be amazing and healing. And Calvin's trying to pull Beth into this sort of orbit of, let's meet with the doctor. And she's like, he doesn't know us. Why would I do that?
It's a private matter that we handle.
It's a private matter. Right. And, you can just see the resistance around, don't make me confront this, especially with Conrad. Don't bring me into this thing, because we cannot exist in this space together around this wound. And you can see it.
Conrad says several times, she hates me. Mm-hmm. And a few times Calvin, asks Beth, do you hate him? And she would say, how could a mother hate? It's never this direct answer. It's always this kind of meta, how could a mother hate her son? A mother can't hate her son.
Mothers don't hate their sons.
Yeah, she's talking about like roles rather than talking about people and putting herself into it.
And there's a callback later where at the end he says, Beth, do you love me? She says, I feel the way I've always felt about you.
Oh yeah. That part, as well as maybe it's the last therapy session that Conrad has in the middle of the night, I think were the two most powerful parts in the movie to me.
It was
just such this obvious her not answering Calvin's question.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, it's interesting to hear you talk about the impact that Mary Tyler Moore's performance had on you, compared with who she was in her show and really who the general public knew her to be previous to this. And I'm certain that that's really a reason why this performance was so powerful, is because it was so juxtaposed against everything we had seen so far. But I think for me, watching it for the first time, I had so much sadness for her because I saw what was going on the whole time. Mm-hmm. Like I saw, here is this woman who has had this unbearable tragedy happen to her and her family, the loss of a son. And she has convinced herself that the only way through it is to pretend it didn't happen. Mm-hmm. And without opening herself to any, not even a specific one, but any other possibilities, she is gripping as tightly as she can to her belief in her solution. And it is wrecking everybody around her.
Absolutely. And that's the brilliance of it, right? It's that from a story structure standpoint, she functions as the antagonist, the villain, if you will. And yet you don't experience her with animosity or hatred. You experience her with deep sadness, right? You get it. Like there's not one part of you that doesn't get, even when she's being cold and dismissive and even mean, you get it. And that's the brilliance of that. It's not a one or two dimensional antagonist. It's this person that's functioning in this role of being this destructive force who you can totally get and relate to. Yeah. And we could all be there. All of us can be there.
If we were going to be movie matchmakers, maybe we'd set her up with the dad from Dead Poet Society.
Oh, good.
Who function in a very similar way. I think that, another good example of that kind of solution that she was trying to employ was at a certain part of the movie, she decides to go into, was the older brother's name Buck? Was that it?
Buck, yeah.
Yeah. She goes into Buck's room, which is pristinely preserved.
Yes.
She sits on the bed and she's just kind of like having what looks to be a very unusual moment, taking it all in. Like she gave herself permission for a second to re-engage. And then Conrad comes home and just kind of like, hey, Mom, through the doorway. She gets scared to death and she's like,
yes,
don't do that. Why would you do that? And he just got home from school, but it was the vulnerability of that moment. She had worked so hard to not let Conrad specifically, but everybody else see how this has affected her. And for a moment he saw, and it was almost unbearable.
Yes, that she cared about it and that it was important to her. And you think about what happened in that same scene right after that, right? So it was, she says, don't do that and don't ever do that, and gets freaked out. She stands up and they're on the landing, upstairs landing outside the bedroom doors. And she's standing in front of her bedroom door. And he says something like, I got a 74 on a trig test.
Yeah.
She goes, oh, trig, that was always so hard, or something like this. So, it was always so hard for, and he goes, you took trig? And she says, did I take trig? Huh. And then she makes some throwaway comment of like, fold up your laundry or something, and goes into her room. Like she's completely disorganized by it. Like she's like, she went back into the, I'm just going to do the superficial, like, oh, trig so hard, whatever. And then when he was like, and then she got like, you could just, and again, some of it's the writing and some of it's the acting in that moment, but the performance just nailed, like she's internally disorganized.
I took it as a little bit of a dissociative moment too.
That's what I mean. Yeah. She's not in her head at that moment.
Yeah. Which, last week's show, my guest, Natalie, specializes in dissociative identity disorder. And, through talking with her, learned it's a self-protective measure,
Sure.
Almost like a form of IFS, where you develop these dissociated parts as a way to protect certain things that, need to be protected, or even protect the whole person, but in certain scenarios.
Yes.
The Judd Hirsch, we talked a little bit earlier, joked about, identifying with him, but I couldn't help but think and want to, draw a correlation between his therapy scenes in this movie, which, by the way, smoking during session, in a very small closed room.
You don't do that, Josh?
I don't.
That's not your deal?
I did have a client ask me one time if he could vape during our session. And
I did too. Yeah.
At the time, because it was very early on, and when I was practicing, I had never, this is a totally example of how my personality works. I had never thought about that. And so I felt unsettled by having never thought about it and feeling unprepared in the moment. So I just punted to like, no, the landlord doesn't allow that kind of stuff in here. And I felt like, all right, that's pretty good. Pretty good.
Pretty good. Yeah.
Yeah. But I can't help but think about, the power of the scenes between Robin Williams and Matt Damon in Good Will Hunting. Felt something very similar with, Judd Hirsch and Timothy Hutton, especially in that last kind of middle of the night in the rain, which I even thought about that. That would have been an interesting clip to show in our ethics class. What happens when a client calls you in the middle of the night? What do? Do you go to your office and meet them and let them in and have a session at 2 a.m.? I felt like I'm interested to hear what you thought about him as a therapist. I was trying to kind of piece together what angle he was coming at it from. I felt like it was very insight-based, very kind of Rogerian, ask a lot of questions, help the client get there on their own kind of way. But that last, therapy session and I think that this is such a beautiful example of talk therapy on its own is not a magic wand that you wave that fixes everything. Rather, it's a way of helping somebody process their life. So if he would have just had, a few sessions, but the things that happened outside of the sessions hadn't happened, to kind of move him closer to this insight he has in the last one. I don't think he would have been able to kind of land where he landed. But, we see that he lands at a place where he has a tremendous amount of survivor's guilt, where I think his line was, she hates me for doing just one thing. And then, the therapist says, what's the one thing? What's the one thing? And he says, for staying with the boat, for basically for surviving.
I held on.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that part just rocked me, because it felt so, it's exactly what you said earlier, such a powerful performance from Timothy Hutton. It felt so real.
Oh yeah. Yeah. It's an all-timer for me. That whole scene, that sequence, again, for me, connecting this back to my own story, I think that was as close to anything I've ever seen in film or television. The kind of moment that I think came close to changing my life, because even though after that I was still on this sort of, I'll go into broadcasting trajectory, it was in the back of my head. And when I thought about, well, what comes next if I'm not going to do that, that was sort of the, by that point, this was clearly my favorite movie. It was clearly a movie I referenced in my head a lot. And to see this sort of relationship, and I guess it's no surprise that I still see older teens and young adults. That's who I see. That's what was depicted in the movie. And, but the things that hit me were, there are things below the surface that can be unearthed, and it can lead people to greater health. Mm-hmm. We're really, I think, as a 17-year-old, 16, 17-year-old, very new thoughts for me, and very profound. And so I think that all got realized in that scene, but all throughout the movie. If you think about how the progression of it is very intentional. So when he starts, Judd Hirsch is sort of distracted. He's, looking at a chart. He's facing his desk away from him. He's smoking. He's kind of not sort of like a game stuff there, but you can see it sort of evolve where he's digging at things a little bit, being honest with him in ways that no one else is being honest, to the point where at the final scene, I am your friend. Now, as therapists, to be honest, we would rarely say that. Yeah. Because we think of our relationship as being boundaried, and that we're not, and that's part of what makes it powerful in a different way, is that we are not social friends of people. Doesn't mean we don't like them or love them or care about them. It just means that we're not, we don't have the same kind of relationship as a parent or a friend. All that stuff can be brought into the relationship by the client potentially, but we're not different. But the message there is still true, right? The communication, even though we might not say I'm your friend, the communication that we're giving to clients is, I am for you. I care about you. This isn't just a job for me. It's not just, well, I'm not on the clock. It's 2:00 in the morning. I'll see you 2 days from now. It's, this is an authentic relationship where I care about you. That to me was a very powerful thing. And I think that got very, very fully realized in the course of their relationship, particularly in that scene. In terms of what model he's operating from, it's probably more in the, kind of psychodynamic realm, although it's not necessarily a clearly, sort of articulated model. I think what does come out is, like you said, what we know is that what drives the engine of therapy is the authenticity and the genuineness of the relationship. And that people, if they can do that as a therapist, be authentic and genuine, then the model can work no matter what. In other words, as long as they know what they're doing. If they're a cognitive behavioral therapist, a psychodynamic therapist, a Rogerian, if they can operate, if they know their model and they can operate well within it, if they have that sort of genuine empathy, that ability to connect on an authentic level, that's what makes therapy work.
Well, there's not really many purists around either. So,
right.
More than likely he wasn't like strictly Rogerian or strictly CBT or whatever it is. Most people, pick from different baskets, and that's okay. But I got the sense, I said something about showing in ethics class, but I got the sense that's probably not something he does a lot. The reason why Timothy Hutton got a hold of him at that late hour is because he just found out that a friend of his had committed suicide or had completed suicide. And so my guess is that he recognized the level of distress in his voice, and he made an exception to maybe what was a professional boundary, but he did his job.
And I think that's what we find in really good therapists is that they have what we call a nuanced ethical compass, right? It's not rigid, it's nuanced. And so I'll use myself as an example. I've done this job for 29 years. I love it. I don't feel anywhere close to burning out. I've seen, I don't know the number, but it's probably 3,000 to 4,000 clients. I've logged 30,000 therapy hours plus. And I'm not saying that to brag, I'm saying that to put this into a context. I got that call one time, and I met someone at a Waffle House because I couldn't get into our building. But I did. I got that call. I've cut my wrists, and I'm not going to go to the hospital. My mom's with me. My arms are bandaged, and I was like, "You need to go to the hospital." I won't go, and I'm like, "I will see you." But then, and so we had a meeting that was the precursor to him going to the hospital.
Yeah.
Right. I've never had a client that while I'm seeing them has had a completed suicide. But I have had a number who've taken pills or cut them, or something like that. He was one that I got the call and I'm like, I had to make a judgment call. I would never have a therapy session in a Waffle House.
Yeah.
Until I had to have a session in a Waffle House.
Yeah.
And so that's the nature of this is that, there are rules that exist, but really ultimately our ethics exist for the protection of the client, for the well-being of the client. And then we have to make these judgment calls. And so over the course of, almost 30 years, there are all kinds of weird curveballs that come our way that are like, okay, yeah, maybe I wouldn't take the 2 a.m. call and go into the office for just someone who was, just wanting to talk to me.
Yeah.
But maybe when you could tell in someone's voice that there's something horrible that's happened, we have to talk. Maybe you would make that call.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that, it goes to kind of what we get taught in grad school. And I think what we get taught every time we have a session or, reinforced at least, that ours is a role where we are in the here and now as much as we can. And we attune with the client as much as we can. And I think that something that I struggled with this a lot at the beginning, because in my head, I felt very safe by following the rules, by following the ethics. And my supervisor said to me once that, this was my last day at the agency I was working at. And she said, if I could give you anything on your way out the door, it would be this. Please listen to your gut and act on your gut. Because I have lost count of how many times you came into supervision and you said, well, the client said this and I was thinking this. And then I would ask you, well, did you say it? And then you would say, well, no, I wanted to talk to you about it before and she said, you don't have the same gut that John Q. Public has anymore. You have a clinically trained gut, and your gut I've never seen it be wrong in the times that you've been working for me. And so I just want to encourage you to listen to it and act on it. And, that was 4 years ago, and it's still scary. But what I found is, and I think this is like trust in any relationship, the more times that I trust it, the easier, not easy, it is to then do it the next time, because and I think also just knowing, all right, there's not really anything I could do to like mess somebody up in these moments, because I can always circle back and repair. So if I say something that that I recognize as hurtful or incorrect or whatever, I can always circle back and apologize and repair. And
yeah, that's good stuff there. And a couple thoughts. One is about ethics and one is about clinical judgment. And the first about ethics is that we often, as therapists, we're trained very, very heavily in boundaries, right? Keep your boundaries, but really those boundaries are intended to keep the client safe and to keep the relationship healthy. It's really about the protection of the client. And so sometimes we get we reverse it in our head, and we think that boundaries are really about us keeping information or not doing certain things that are just sort of for us. I'm not saying there's not a role of self-care and a role of kind of healthy boundaries for ourselves, but primarily from an ethics standpoint, boundaries are really about protecting that relationship and making keeping that client protected and healthy. But what you're talking about is clinical judgment. And the piece of that really strikes me is,
but I got those confused.
Right.
That was part of my problem.
That's part of what I was speaking to it. Yeah, that, and also that we when we're coming out of grad school and early in our career, we're very fearful in some respects about making a mistake. And part of the freedom of this is like, hey, you're going to make a mistake. You're going to make a mistake. You're going to laugh when you shouldn't have laughed. You're going to blow past something you shouldn't have blown past. You're going to make an interpretation you shouldn't have made. You're going to have nonverbals that communicate disinterest. You're going to there's 1,000 ways to trip up, and that's part of having an authentic relationship, is like that's going to happen. But then, as best as we can, we're going to repair it. And interestingly, the research says that when there is a V-shaped repair in the relationship, meaning we're traveling along and then there's a rip in the relationship, something, a misstep, and we drop off the cliff. But then we repair it and we build back up again, that the point that we build back up to often is better, stronger, more therapeutic than previously. So not that we would seek out these kind of ruptures in the relationship, but when they happen, they're always opportunities for us.
They're opportunities for connection. Yeah.
Right. For deeper connection and for deeper work, deeper trust. So that's what, and then there's that becomes very freeing in some respects of like, okay, I'm going to bring my A game as best I can, but I'm going to mess up at times. And if we become aware of that together, or I become aware, then we're gonna work to repair it.
Yeah, and I think that's like a principle in relationship that I find is true for me, and that is, whenever I am in relationship with somebody that shows a degree of humility, that when they are hurtful or they mess up in some way, that they circle back and recognize the hurt and apologize. Yeah. And it doesn't have to be them instigating it or initiating it. I mean, I could come to them and say that as well, but to have the humility to be empathetic and recognize my hurt and not even in a I was wrong kind of way, because they could have done something that was completely right and justified that still hurt.
Yeah.
But just to say, I'm so sorry I hurt you, to me, that demonstrates a person who is not trying to come off as Beth did in the movie, that they have it all together, that they're perfect, that they have no flaws or they have no struggles, but rather they have all of those things, and that I can trust them to steward their relationship with me as best they can, and know that if we trip up, they're going to do their best to catch it. That to me it's like a bat signal that goes up that says, yeah, you can trust this person. So I think it would be true in the therapeutic relationship as well, that after that happens, that person goes, oh, my therapist is a human, and they're not just a white coat that walks in the room and talks at me for 15 minutes and then leaves.
Absolutely. 100%.
Not that there's anything wrong with integrated behavioral healthcare, but it's a different thing than what we do.
Yeah. Not that there's anything wrong with it, as we say in Seinfeld terms.
Yada, yada, yada. And then the guy just left. That's,
yada, yada, yada. That's right.
Well, is there anything else from the movie that you want to touch on before we move on to the next thing?
Well, I'll just say at the end, because it's a 40-year-old movie, I wasn't sure. I hadn't seen the movie in probably 25, 30 years. And I have this weird thing where I rarely see movies twice, even movies I like, because I always think in this 2-hour block, I could be watching a movie I haven't experienced before. So it's very rare. This movie I've probably seen, I know I've seen it 3 times, probably 4 times. I think I've seen it 4 times now, but I haven't seen it in maybe 25 years. I was worried that it was going to be not just in hairstyle and fashion and all that dated, but just it wouldn't hold up, and it held up. It is scene by scene, near perfect. Every scene matters. Every scene's important. And think about that. It won Best Picture. It beat Raging Bull, which is considered by critics to be one of the best films of the 80s and really of the the past 50 years. And there's debate about whether it should have won or not. It doesn't, to me, it doesn't. Both of them can be great movies. The point being, with that such a great movie, it still prevailed. Timothy Hutton beat Joe Pesci for Raging Bull, if that gives you an idea of the strength of this performance. So it is the total package of performance, direction, writing, scene by scene. It is just absolutely perfect. But the reason I say all that is to say, it's a 40-year-old movie that a lot of people now have not seen. And if you want to see just a great movie, I'd recommend it, but also a scene that gives a glimpse into people and relationships and families that I think still holds up, and I think is still really profound and really necessary. Like, we're still playing the same games that we were playing back then in relationships. We're still trying to nice up things that we can't nice up. We're still trying to present images that belie things below the surface. We're still trying to deny that we have feelings about that. We're still doing the same stuff. I think it's still a very, very relevant and profound movie.
Yeah. I think that I'm just so surprised that we didn't watch clip after clip of this in our family systems class. I think Timothy Hutton, I had never seen him in this movie. Obviously, it's the first time I've seen the movie, but I've never seen somebody as their younger self look so much like their adult self. Like, he looked like as if they had taken that de-aging technology they have now and just put it on him, because he just looked like Timothy Hutton, just skinnier and, a little bit of less wrinkles. I think that one thing that the movie does so well, we touched on this a little bit, is it shows you that people aren't inherently evil, cold, whatever, that there's always something happening behind the curtain. And I just think to see Beth just desperately clinging to the thing that she's convinced will save her. And then this interesting thing happens at the end where Conrad, in his therapy session, finally makes this connection with, I'm so burdened by this guilt that I lived and my brother died. While at the same time, in the scene that bookends that, Calvin and Beth have that conversation in the dining room where Calvin says, "Do you love me?" "Well, I feel the way I've always felt about," and you see, and then she leaves, she packs up and she leaves. Although I got to tell you, when she went up to their room and went up into the top of the closet, I was scared to death because I thought she was getting a gun. I thought she was going to off herself right there. But you see basically what could have been the dissolution of their marriage, or it could have been, a separation, whatever it is. But you see this person connect with themselves, and then immediately these two people disconnect from each other. And just the profoundness of that to me as well was very striking.
You hit on something that I just want to underline, and that is we've talked a lot about Mary Tyler Moore as Beth and how great the performance was, how great the writing is. And what you hit on with talking about her is, I think, also a profound truth. And that is, people had an experience of her as a warm and generous and fun person. And Conrad had the experience of her as a cold and distant and unloving person. And both those things were true.
Yeah.
And part of maturity, psychological maturity, emotional maturity for us as people is the ability to hold two seemingly contradictory things together at the same time. There's a whole therapy called dialectical behavior therapy. Dialectical, holding these sort of like seemingly contradictory or things that are in tension about ourselves, about certain aspects of reality, and about other people. And that's what was held in that. Like, she was not, I use the term that she's a villain. She functions as a villain in the story from a story, telling standpoint, but she's not a bad person. She is a person that this is her way of coping with profound loss. This is her, had it not happened, she would have gone about her superficially charming way, and the family would have taken nice pictures at Christmas and all the stuff would have happened. And
that scene.
Again, one of my favorite scenes is the picture taking scene. So everything about it is perfect. But that's, Beth sort of, again, talking about profoundness of this movie, embodies that in a way that I'd never seen a movie before, and I think still speaks to us now. Like, all this stuff is true of her as a human. She is cold and unloving, and she is warm and generous, and she is a person that cared about her marriage and her at least older son, and loved them, and also a person that couldn't go there. There's a lot of stuff about the human experience and condition that's wrapped up in that.
I'm wondering if you could share something with me that you have learned from your clients.
Oh yeah, love to. So as I said, I almost predominantly or exclusively see young adult age guys. So I see guys that are in their later teens through their 20s. And I started off initially being trained as a child and adolescent psychologist. So I would see younger kids, teenagers, and as they got older, I sort of, there's a certain point where you don't want to be on the floor with a bunch of Legos. There's just a certain developmental trajectory as a therapist, at least for me. And so I started seeing older teens, and then older teens and guys in their 20s, and now mostly guys in their later teens and 20s. And it's just been very rich for me, because that's the time of life where people are trying to figure themselves out. Erickson said that the identity development stuff happened in adolescence, but now we're seeing that pushed into young adulthood, right? It's not so much a task of a 15, 16-year-old as it is a 19, 20, 22-year-old to figure out self and identity. And so I love being kind of in the muckety muck of that and the journey of that. But one of the things I would say, two things come to mind. One is that I think what I've learned is that there are a lot of ways to be a man, and a lot of really good ways to be a man. The variety of ways to be a man is wide and deep. And so that's been really cool for me to see that up front, is to see people who are becoming men, they're young men becoming men, and the great variety within that. So that has been cool for me to see. And the other is that I've seen from them that men care very deeply about their relationships. Mm-hmm. In a way that we don't often hear or see or think about. We often think like when there's a couple that breaks up, that the woman cares and she's going to be emotional. I will tell you, it's rare that a month goes by that I don't have a guy crying in my office about a relationship.
Oh yeah, guys will get devastated from breakups, and part of that is because I think they try to keep, the hole in their dam of emotion plugged very tightly while they're in the relationship. And then when it's over, they realize, oh no, I didn't say this. I didn't do that. I didn't, and it's.
Yeah, that's often the case. But they care very deeply. Like that's the one thing that's been very eye-opening is how deeply guys care about their relationships. They care about their relationships with their significant others. They care about their relationships with their parents and siblings, with their friends. The relationships are very, very vital and important. And so I think that's been good for me to see that has also encouraged me to increasingly be intentional and to prioritize the whole gamut of relationships for me. Yeah. So I've learned a lot from my clients.
Nice. Tell me something that you do to take care of yourself.
Yeah, so I do a lot of things that some of them are kind of traditional, some of them are a little unique and quirky. I'm a bit of a quirky bird in some ways, but even what we're talking about now, watching movies, thinking about movies, talking about movies, I am blessed to have a wife that likes to do that, so that's been cool. I also have some friends. So not only do I have some friends, but I have some friends that like to do that. And so there are a number of movies that my wife and I like to see together, or types of movies. And then there are movies outside of that she doesn't care for. So I have a roster of guys that I call my movie boyfriends. And so my movie boyfriends and I, back when we could actually go to movie theaters, we'd go see the movies that our wives wouldn't want to see. And we talk about those as well. So runs the whole gamut of movies. So I like movies. I like kind of watching, experiencing, talking, thinking about them. I'm also a little bit of a gamer. I have some limits on my gaming out of necessity, but every Monday night and Thursday night, I play for about an hour and a half, 2 hours online with my brother and one of my sons. And we, play Call of Duty or something fun. And it's kind of like poker night. We're on Xbox Live and we can talk and get caught up from the week. And so that's been just, it's really just a super fun way to keep connection, and also it's just good self-care.
Wow.
And then on the quirky side, well, no, I'll tell you one non-quirky thing, and I'll tell you the quirky stuff. The other non-quirky thing is I'm a writer. And years ago, I was challenged by, I've gone to a lot of like writing intensives and writing workshops. And actually the guy who wrote Groundhog Day, Danny Rubin, challenged me to say, if you want to be a writer, you're going to have to write every day. You're going to have to think of yourself. That's how you decide if you're a writer, is if you write every day. So I write every day. So every day, that's part of my end of the day.
Which really, routine. At that point, you don't have to decide.
Right.
You just are.
Right. Yeah, I'm a writer. So that the quirky things are, I will say, semi-embarrassing, like a 3 or 4 on a 10 scale. One is that I every night after dinner, before we watch whatever shows we're going to watch or hang out or whatever, I take a very hot bath and read a magazine. And so I do. I go into the guest room bathroom, which is sort of preserved for the bathtub, read a magazine in a hot bath for about 20 minutes, and then work all the kinks out, detox, rest of the night, good to go. And then the most quirky thing is this one's maybe a 4 or 5.
We're progressing. Okay.
Yeah, we're sliding into this. I am also an amateur magician, and I practice magic tricks as a way
gosh.
of
Dave, you
de-stressing.
really are my new hero. Oh my God.
So I have all these, you can't see it over here, but on the side, all these little magic tricks I'm working on. I it's just total geek out with the magic. So
before the pandemic hit,
yeah,
did you have a chance to go to House of Cards here in Nashville?
Okay, I'm going to tell you a little House of Cards story. The answer is yes to that. But the other answer is that I auditioned to be a magician at the House of Cards, and I got accepted and was put on the list, but have never done it. Like he said, you're definitely on the list.
So you're good then. Holy cow.
Good enough to get past the audition.
Wow.
So, but I've never, in fairness, if you say I've worked at, I've never, right. Apart from a dinner there, I've never set foot in there to work. But he said, you're definitely on the list. He did make it clear a lot of people make their primary living and they were first call. And he knew that this was sort of a side venture for me. And he was like, and then everything, kind of the world went crazy. And then I never heard back. And I don't even know if I'm on the list anymore or not, but I did. I passed, I apparently cleared the audition.
Wow. That is one of my favorite dates I've ever been on with my wife as we went there. I wish we could do it more often. We just,
yeah.
It is
little dinero there.
It's not cheap. It's not cheap.
Little pricey.
So let's say that somebody was listening to our conversation today, and rightfully so, they thought to themselves, Dave is amazing. I would love to become his client, or I would love for my son or somebody I love to become his client. How do they get a hold of you?
Well, let me say I'm part of a great practice called Southeast Psych. And in particular, Southeast Psych Nashville. We have offices in Charlotte. We also have this office in Nashville. The reason why I'm here is because one of the people that worked for us in Charlotte was from Nashville and had a vision of starting a branch of Southeast Psych here. And then I agreed to come help start it. And so we've got about 11, 12 clinicians. It's just a great team, a great place, fun. So I'd tell them to look up the website, Southeast Psych Nashville. I right now am, I only see young adult age guys, pretty full, not necessarily, my interest in doing the podcast is more to talk about these ideas more than to draw people to my practice. But if someone feels like they'd be a good match, give us a call. And then if it's not me, then I can definitely find somebody that's a good fit there. Again, really great team, really proud of those people, and serve, the whole range. Like some people just see itty bitties, some people only see adults and couples. So a really cool team to be part of, and has made the work life here just amazingly good.
Yeah, I think that one of the cool things about if a person works at an agency, more often than not, the other people at the agency, there's common threads there to where, if somebody feels like they have really enjoyed listening to you and connecting with you, the other people that are going to be at Southeast Psych are not going to be radically different in the sense that, like, if they called up, hey, I want to see Dave. Well, Dave's a little full right now. Can we offer you Bill? Bill's going to be great too,
Good.
That
yeah. Now all I have to do is hire Bill.
There you go. We got to find a Bill. Dave, I can't even begin to express to you how much I've enjoyed talking, and I'm just so glad that we were able to make it happen. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it. It was a great conversation.
Oh yeah. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for joining me this week in the theater. I'll make sure I save a seat for you and a friend next week. Let's raise the lights, lower the curtain, and say that for this week, the theater is closed.